Okay, I'm very excited to be talking to Jim Dahle. Actually, that's Dr. Jim Dahle. He is a full-time board-certified emergency physician. Funny thing about bringing him on a personal finance show, but actually it's not that funny because he's also the author of the book and has a website called The White Coat Investor. Jim, real pleasure to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So you talk about, or your book is The Doctor's Guide to Personal Finance and Investing. Is this just for doctors?
Well, I mean, the truth is 95% of personal finance and investing applies to everybody. There's very little of it that is actually physician specific. But I do try to hone in on that as well as focus on teaching the other 95% to physicians and other high income professionals.
Okay, that's a good model. I remember, and certainly a group I think that needs it. I remember when I was working actually on Wall Street, everyone always said, well, you should go for the doctors because they have all the money. And the interesting thing was that they had a lot of opinions about how to invest. And, well, between you and me, they weren't always very good opinions. Has that been your experience as well?
The doctors are terrible with money. I mean, everybody kind of dances around it, but we're awful. Not just the average, but the vast majority. And I'm not sure why that is, whether it's the fact that we don't get any personal finance or training in our medical school and residency, or whether we're just not interested in it, or whether we're arrogant, or whether we're too trusting of other professionals. But I think a lot of it is just the big jump from not making anything to making a bunch and not really understanding business very well. I think those are probably the main issues.
So this impression that a lot of people have that high income professionals like doctors and dentists and lawyers, that they always know how to manage their money, that you would say is a myth?
I would say that's a terrible myth. And we're worse than the average person, I think, just because we assume that due to the high income that we can spend money willy-nilly and still be okay. And the truth of the matter is, especially with the cost of education these days, if you are not really watching your finances your first few years out of training, you can get into some deep trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we see that a lot. So one of the issues, I guess, that one of the reasons that doctors would say that they have this problem a lot is because they're just busy. They're residents for 1,000 hours a week, and then they're interns and full time, and they just don't have the time to manage their money. Is that a good excuse?
I think that's a lousy excuse. The truth of the matter is, if you actually, divided out the cost of somebody else managing your money, the hourly rate of doing it is probably more than you're earning, even as a highly paid surgeon. And so it's really not a very good excuse. It's certainly one that's used often, and doctors are busy, but they're not too busy. So I'd like to see them spend a little more time on their finances. It's probably more of an interest problem than a time problem.
Okay, so one of the areas that I found in speaking to doctors is, like many professionals, they know a lot about their field, and so they always want to buy, shares of stock in a pharmaceutical company. Does that make sense to buy what you know?
Obviously, it doesn't. It doesn't really make sense to have a large position in any one company. And I think those who have done much reading or studying of investing have learned the value of diversification. But even simple concepts like that don't get taught to doctors in their training. And so sometimes they might think that owning the shares of one or two companies is smart investing, whereas that's really just bringing on uncompensated risk into their portfolio.
Okay, so I'm a big fan of diversification, certainly a topic that we cover on the show, I would say, every episode. So let's assume that's a given, that it's important to diversify. On the other hand, let me just give you an example. I recently spent a lot of time dealing with healthcare issues, and one of the things I noticed is that this one company, Baxter, their name was on everything in the hospital and all the patient stuff. And I can see where a doctor says, I go through, I open packages every day, 100 times a day from this one company. Shouldn't I buy that stock? Don't they have some insight, or wouldn't that be a reasonable way to choose an investment?
Well,
I'm not recommending the stock, by the way.
They may have insight into the company and into the product. But when it really comes to valuing the company, like somebody who works on Wall Street would be taught to do, the doctor's never been taught to do that. And so I think it's almost, they almost run into a little bit of arrogance and assume because they're implanting devices from this company that they really know how that company runs as a business. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we probably get into an overconfidence problem investing in what we know. So I generally recommend that doctors diversify very broadly. And if they're going to, make a bet on a single company, that they keep it to less than 5% of their portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I hear that's a reasonable way to go. We're talking with Dr. Jim Dahle. He is the author of The White Coat Investor, a doctor's guide to personal finance and investing. But it's not only meant for doctors. He was telling us before. Jim was also explaining that a lot of times professionals do a really crummy job at handling their money. One of the things you were talking about was more of a psychological reason why they're bad at handling. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I think part of it is you assume because you're really good at one thing that you're really good at other things. And the truth of the matter is that personal finance and investing is a very different field from emergency medicine or general surgery or nephrology. And you can't assume that just because you know everything about nephrology that you know anything about investing. You actually have to take the time to spend some time learning and put some effort into realizing how the business world works.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the doctors that I know, they have managers who run their business and they're not involved in that. And their ultimate goal is, if they're surgeons, they just want to be cutting. If they are, whatever their field is, that's what they want to be doing. They just, apart from not having the skill, which they may recognize, they don't even have the interest. Is that reasonable for them to outsource the work?
I think it absolutely is reasonable for somebody who does not have the interest. The interest is really important because there's a certain amount of knowledge you have to gain. Now, I don't think it's the same amount of knowledge you need to be able to practice pulmonology or nephrology, but there is a certain amount of knowledge that must be mastered. And you also need to have the discipline to not only save an adequate percentage of your money, but also maintain your investing plan for decades. And if you have neither that, if you don't have that interest, you're unlikely to acquire that knowledge or that discipline and be successful. And if that's the case, it's worth paying what turns out to be rather high fees to a professional to manage your money for you. But that's not to say that a doctor cannot learn to do it himself and to do it very well. But it just is something that you have to actually put some time and effort and interest into. And if you don't have that interest, it's unlikely that you're going to learn enough to be successful.
Right. Well, one of the things that I have found as a financial advisor over many years is that the people who seem to do better are the people who are able to discipline themselves in terms of their budgeting, in terms of their savings, even in terms of their charity, and of course in the way that they manage their investments. You'd think that doctors should be pretty good at being disciplined because otherwise they never would have gotten to where they are today. Do you find that they maybe have a little stronger sense of discipline than other parts of the population?
Oh, absolutely. Doctors are experts in delayed gratification. I mean, they basically go throughout their 20s and the first half of their 30s without making any money at all. The problem is when they finally start making it, it's almost like they go to extremes. And before they're even out of residency, they've already purchased a $1.5 million house with nothing down. And so I think sometimes that discipline breaks down right as they start hitting the paychecks, which is really the key time to be focused on your finances and really get it right. Because if you can get it right in the first 2 to 5 years out of your training, you're pretty much on easy street the rest of your career. But too many doctors just blow those first few years.
So what would you suggest to them as they're just getting started so they don't blow it?
I give them 4 words of advice. Live like a resident. A typical resident makes about $50,000 a year, which is about the average American household income. And a typical attending physician might be making $200,000 or $250,000 or $300,000. And the problem doctors have is managing that jump from a resident income to an attending income. They grow right into it or grow past it. But if they will just continue their same lifestyle they had as a resident for just a couple more years, they can pay off all their student loans, save up a down payment for their dream home, and catch up to their college roommates as far as retirement savings goes. But they've got to be disciplined those first few years out and grow into their income as slowly as they can.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's tough. It's simply a decision they make because as soon as they get that first big check that's 4 times larger than they got last year, I guess it's a little bit tempting to spend some of the money.
That's exactly right. And in fact, I advocate they do spend a little bit of the money. In fact, they can give themselves a 50% raise, which would be huge in any other industry, and still have enough to carve out to build wealth. But the problem is they give themselves a 400% raise. And that's not going to cut it. You're just not going to be able to pay off your loans in a timely manner and really start building your wealth the way you'd like to if you allow your spending to grow that quickly.
I think this model of live like a resident is something that could apply to people who aren't doctors as well. A lot of times someone gets an inheritance and all of a sudden he says, well, yippee, I got $1 million. And right away he spends it. It's the same problem that people have when they win a lottery. They blow through that money and more before, literally within 2 years. And I guess if you could just tell people just for a little longer, maintain your lifestyle, you'll be in a better situation.
That's exactly right. In a lot of ways, doctors have a lot in common with entertainers and professional athletes in that their high income is due to a particular skill or talent they have rather than their business acumen. By the time a small business owner is making a doctor-like income, he's had years of experience in the business world, but the doctor doesn't have that.
Right here. All right. Jim, I like that. Live like a resident. I think we'll title the episode Live Like a Resident and see what people think. Unfortunately, I know you have a lot more information, but we are just about out of time here. So tell people, tell us, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Well, the best way is to come to the website at whitecoatinvestor.com. Or if you prefer to read a book, The White Coat Investor, A Doctor's Guide to Personal Finance and Investing, can be found at Amazon or anywhere else you would buy either print or electronic books.
All right. So we will put links to that at the show notes of goldsteinongelt.com. Jim Dahle, I really appreciate your spending the time today.
Thank you for having me on.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.